can pretty much guarantee that it has changed, that your mental model is stale. The question is whether it's changed in a way that erodes your expertise. We can all assume that our mental model is wrong and incomplete, and that's baseline. The interesting question is whether it's changed in a way that has eroded our expertise relevant to the current crisis situation that we're trying to resolve.
Let me tell you a quick story. A while back, in a podcast not so far away, we brought in David Leigh. And what started as a conversation about incident response turned into something unexpected. A masterclass in storytelling as a tool for learning. We didn't realize it then, but David helped us shift our mental model. We retired the term RCA, we stopped asking what went wrong, who, how, and started asking, what's the story here? And what is it trying to teach us? David's tale spread, got cited in retrospectives, quoted in documents, and even echoed in hallways, and influenced how we think about learning itself. So now in season 3, it only felt right to bring David back. Because if storytelling can teach us by making things memorable, what happens when learning becomes a discipline? How could it shape resilience? David, welcome back. Hope I did it all right on the storytelling of your previous episode. How did I do? Any director's cut you want to introduce?
No, it's fine. It was nice to have the practice run and then the one that went live as well. Hopefully, it was even better as a result.
I mean, definitely. I mean, that's software engineering to you, David. So, welcome back to the show, David. Season 3 is all about resilience. What it means, why it matters, and how we can build it into everything we do. What does resilience mean to you?
To me, it's about how we respond to surprises that challenge our ideas about how the world works or how our systems work. And it's about whether we're prepared to adapt to those kinds of novel surprises, things that make us scratch our heads and say, I didn't know it could do that, or I don't even know how it ever worked. And it's about whether in those situations we are scrambling and working in a completely ad hoc basis, trying to figure things out, or whether we have laid some preparations for dealing with those situations. Because the reality is those situations happen, and that not infrequently. And sometimes they're very, very serious. And so resilience is about being prepared to deal with those kinds of situations.
Yeah, prepare for the unexpected. I think in our previous session, we talked about there's a huge difference between how developers and engineers may think how system works in production. It may be quite different.
Mhm.
David, before we go further, first of all, congratulations on your new role. Since leaving IBM, you have stepped into a different environment and set of challenges. Can you tell us a bit more about what you're doing now and how that may have shaped your view of learning and resilience?
One thing I've been doing is helping directly with some community building efforts. For example, this evening I'm going to be helping at a free dinner event where that happens monthly in a small town nearby, where they get about 100 people, most of whom have never met each other, and they all sit down and have dinner together. It's got no political or other overtones. It's just about community. And I think that sort of event, those sorts of activities are really important because these community building efforts, they get people of diverse backgrounds and diverse identities, diverse situations to sit down and talk with one another, potentially have dinner together. And actually, there's a direct connection here to resilience. So resilience requires that we can recognize that our model of the system is wrong, and requires the ability to quickly revise that model when it's when in fact it is wrong. So, if we have enough time and the ability to experiment with a system, like anyone, you or I, we can eventually recognize that our model is wrong and we can revise our model and move forward. But what if we're in a crisis where the stakes are high and every second counts? If we're in those situations, we need to be able to bring different perspectives and diverse opinions to the problem. And we need to be able to do that quickly. So resilience necessarily requires the ability to leverage different perspectives during a crisis. Now, I just understand this podcast isn't about politics, but I like to think that this community building stuff is about building and sustaining resilience in a liberal society. And there's a direct parallel with how we build and sustain resilience in the socio-technical systems that folks that listen to your podcast are working with every day.
Wow, David, that's truly inspiring. You're absolutely right in that sustainable resilience, actually, I like that term, draws a lot of parallel from across domains, right? From society to IT systems. I especially like what you said about diversity and how diversity representation and perspective as a vehicle for learning. I think you and I talked about in the past where if we were to have a learning with just one group of folks, say, oh, SREs or oh, sysadmins, the challenges and the solution would just be from that, right? So let's take a minute to go a little bit deeper there. How have you seen that diversity approach of learning lead to a more resilient system over time? Can you perhaps share a concrete example where that diverse perspective directly influences resilience? And maybe on the flip side, can you think of a time when the diverse representation or perspective didn't happen or was not done correctly? What was the impact on the resilience of the system?
Yeah, sure. So one of the roles that I had a few years ago at IBM was I was managing the SRE team that had deployed GitHub Enterprise and was scaling that instance of GitHub Enterprise for all of IBM. And it was an amazing team, and we were faced with an amazing set of problems because the scale of IBM and the number of users and the workload that this system was being asked to handle was way beyond what the GitHub Enterprise product was designed for. The GitHub engineers themselves were scratching their heads and trying, because we were way out beyond the edge of what they had ever seen or tested, and which is kind of surprising. You think GitHub.com handles much larger scale, but GitHub Enterprise is different in some fundamental ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so these were new problems, and surprises were happening all the time. And so it was a 4-person SRE team, and there were many incidents. I got involved in many of them. Of course, when GitHub was down in those days, potentially tens of thousands of IBM developers would not be able to push code, which is a huge deal. And
Mm-hmm.
and so these were critical events. So this SRE team had a really amazing practice where during complex events, the incident commander, whoever it was at the time, would pause and they'd ask the colleagues who were participating in the incident to articulate what each of them thought was happening. What do you think the system's doing? Or what's your theory of what the problem is? And
Mm.
somebody on the call would volunteer and describe what they thought the system was doing. What they're really doing there is they're describing their mental model of the system and why it's doing what they're seeing. And then the incident commander would ask if there's any other ideas about what could be happening. And they would really go out of their way. The incident commander would go out of their way to invite people to share different perspectives. They say, does anyone else have an idea of what's happening that's different from what we just heard? Any other ideas of what it could be? And they make sure that all the possible ideas of what could be happening were heard and considered before they started taking actions. And sometimes they would repeat this process during a complex incident. There'd be moments even after maybe they're in the resolution phase, and they again go back and, okay, what do you think is going to happen here? Anybody else think this? So they really go out of their way to make sure that they're getting all these opinions on the table, considering them. And the result of all this was not only faster incident resolution, but also more effective communication across the response team, because each of the people on the team would better understand what each other were thinking about how the system was
Mm-hmm.
working. They'd have an understanding of each other's mental models, even if the other person's mental model wasn't the same as yours. You at least had an inkling based on that conversation about what that other person thought, and so you could speak to them in terms that they would understand, which is a huge benefit to communication when you're dealing with complex systems. On the flip
Right.
side, over the years, I've seen kind of normal that people can get fixated on one idea of what the system's doing. You get this idea
Mm-hmm.
in your head, and you, even when there's evidence to the contrary, you can keep pushing on one idea of one model of what's happening, and you can eventually dig yourself into a really big hole when it turns out that that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't at all what was happening, and the problem was something else
Right.
entirely. And then on the communication side, we've also seen breakdowns in common ground that happen when team members think that they share an understanding of the system and what it's doing when they actually don't. And so we may be trying to collaborate on solving a problem, and I may assume that you understand the system in the same way that I do, and that when I tell you to do something, you're going to interpret it in the context that I would, but you might actually interpret it in a completely different way. And that happens. And it can really lead to us working at cross purposes. And that can, among other bad outcomes.
Yeah, I intrigue typically when there's a crisis, it's actually really, really difficult to say, hey, let's take a pause here, David.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hear
Mm-hmm.
what people have to say. Typically, it's go, 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 right? I mean, we all been there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did you have experience how in those cases, because there would definitely be folks who are maybe, are always people that are more vocal, and that there are always going to be people that are quieter.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see in those cases that the incident commander is able to hear those quiet voices? Because you and I know sometimes the quiet voices may be the one with a brilliant idea.
Yeah,
I don't know if you have seen that happening in a highly pressure situation like that.
sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, people can be very impatient, very emotional during these high pressure situations. And yeah, it's actually really hard to, sometimes it's hard to even create the space to have that conversation. It has to be part of the culture
Mm-hmm.
so that it's accepted and understood and people understand why we're doing it. And it has to be done in a way that really encourages even the quietest people on the team to raise their voice. And if they say something that's not realistic, it needs to be rejected in a way that doesn't result in them never speaking up in that situation again. So I think it requires that the team kind of commit to creating the safe space for people to raise their voice if they have an idea, understanding that
Mm-hmm.
someday, like, that person with the quiet voice is actually going to have an opinion that everyone needs to hear. And if we shut them down without empathy, we're never going to hear from them again.
Right, and it's like that psychological safety you and I
Mhm.
spoke of that really encourage that culture and that behavior. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of this, and we'll probably come back to this point, is about hedging against overconfidence.
mm,
Experts often know the right answer, but sometimes the system's changed in a way that renders their expertise invalid. And the thing that worked for them every time, the last 20 times over the last 5 years they've been working on the system, or 10 years they've been working on the system, it may not work this time. It may in fact be exactly the wrong thing to do. And so part of this requires that experts be open to the possibility that their expertise is not valid in the current crisis they're dealing in.
It's almost like you can put a timestamp on a best practice.
Mm-hmm.
So if you
Right.
don't allow people to ask a question, why and how, or maybe to have someone that casually prompt those questions, and if somehow we don't have a good answer to that question, no matter how simple it is, hmm,
Yep.
maybe
I
there
like.
is a different way or a better way. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that idea of a kind of a half-life of best practices. And because I mean, one thing that makes IT, one thing that really characterizes IT among other industries is that systems are always changing rapidly and constantly.
Hmm.
And if it's not, even if your code's not changing, the libraries you're running on top of change, and the environments that all that code is running on change constantly. And so it could be that it's changed in a way that breaks some assumptions that you have, and we need to be
Yeah,
open to that.
and definitely, I waiting to bet a Tim Hortons coffee when you visit Canada. In today's world, where systems so complex with all the dependencies, no single person would know how things work. And to
Right.
your point, the mental model I know of how it works with the dependency I know of may have changed without me knowing.
You can pretty much guarantee that it has changed, that your mental model is stale. It's just that's not really the question. The question is whether it's changed in a
Hmm.
way that erodes your expertise,
Mm,
right? Because I think we can all assume that our mental model is wrong
yeah,
and
I like
incomplete,
that.
and that's baseline. The interesting question is whether it's changed in a way that has eroded our expertise relevant to the current crisis situation that we're trying to resolve.
David just gave me a light bulb moment. I think one of the most difficulty for humans to do is to take feedback. A lot of times we get defensive, but if we were to take the perception that David is giving me this feedback because he wants me to do better, or think positively, that's what I'm getting at, then we open up to hearing that. And so if we were to take that model you said, if we believe our mental model how system works is wrong, we will be instantly pretty much change the mindset that we're always open for feedback.
Yeah, I think we should assume that our mental models are always wrong, and we should all be looking
Hmm.
for opportunities to
Hmm.
help repair those mental models.
The other biggest thing, especially with AI, has evolved quite a bit since we last talked. And sorry, there's always a talk of the wrong book, right? We just talk about we should put a half life on IT, and you can put a half life on any ROM book you may have.
Hmm.
On one hand, you may have built an AIOps system that's based on a ROM book Kevin wrote 5 years ago.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, David and the team may be solving things in Slack and conversations. I think part of my takeaway from here is that we should really looking to have an intercept between that 5-year-old ROM book and that 5 second old Slack conversation. And how can we marry that for the learning, right?
Yeah, this is a deep topic. From here, we could talk about confidence. And one thing I'll add here is that a hallmark of being an expert is recognizing or being aware of the limits of your expertise. And so, if we
Ooh.
combine that with this understanding that in IT, our systems are always changing and our mental models are always wrong to some extent, right? Being what it means to be an expert in IT is sort of having that awareness
Hmm.
of where I'm likely to be leaning pretty far out of my skis because the system has changed in ways what I know may no longer be accurate.
I love that.
I think there's a an interesting tension between confidence that we seek and we admire and we reward, and that notion of true expertise where you know where your limits are, and you know when it's okay to say I don't know, I don't understand, this system has changed in ways I no longer recognize. Yeah, there's a true tension there.
And bring that back to that psychological safety. Imagine if the leaders on this call, like a distinguished engineer such as yourself, would say, I am not sure if this is how the system work. If a junior developer hear someone senior like you say that, now all of a sudden they will feel comfortable to do that as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, these are cultural norms that are really important for supporting resilience.
So David, on the flip side, let's just say I want to tell you, hey David, I heard your podcast, I heard your your stories, I believe in it, and I have driven diverse representation in my learning. How would you know it's been given? For example, if I simply have different people showing up on the call, how do I know they're giving their input and shaping the conversations? Are there signals and signs you look for to know that loop has been closed and something meaningful has changed in the way the system or the team is behaving?
I think it's really hard to see evidence of anything you do that's preventative. I mean, these kinds of things we're talking about, and resilience in general, is the kind of thing that prevents incidents from happening. It's not going to result necessarily in fewer incidents. It's not going to improve your, whatever metric you're chasing, because these things aren't measurable. These are preventative efforts that are going to make your system better. We typically only count the errors, the things that go wrong. If things are not going wrong, you don't have anything to count. And because our systems are always changing, the idea that over time we're going to have fewer bad things happening, that's not even valid, because things are changing so fast. Your whole stack is different in 3 to 5 in a year, or 3 or 5.
Mm-hmm.
There's no valid comparisons. I think chasing metrics around this, looking for hard evidence, is really difficult. And I think instead that you need to simply assume that it's not happening.
Mm.
You need to assume that people have ideas in their head about, well, if it's during an incident, they might have things in their head about what the system is doing that they're not saying. If you're talking about maybe a preparation for a go live event, you need to assume that people have concerns in their head about what could go wrong that they're not sharing.
Mm.
And if you come to it with that mindset, that people have concerns that they're not sharing, and it's your job to create the space for them to safely share those thoughts.
Mm.
And if you just kind of always assume that people have important ideas that they're not sharing, then you can avoid overconfidence, and you're going to naturally take steps to create a safe environment for people to share those thoughts. I want to mention here the practice of pre-mortems, which I think is a really great practice that everyone should do. It's really cheap and easy, and it does support this kind of psychological safety that we're talking about. So the pre-mortem is simply like you're going to be doing a big thing, some migration or go live or big deployment, whatever it is, and you get everyone together and you ask them to say, okay, we're going to pretend for a minute that the thing we're preparing for has already happened, and we're going to pretend that it went really, really badly. It was a disaster, unfortunately. And I want you to take a minute and write down reasons you can think of why it went badly. And you ask everyone to do that. You give them 5 minutes to write down all the reasons they can think of why this thing went badly. And then you spend the rest of the time, usually, you take like an hour to do this, and make sure you have a diverse audience, right? And then you group all the ideas, you can rank them by likelihood and impact. And what you're doing is you are kind of gamifying the process of getting people to talk about the things that they're thinking about and not otherwise talking about. You're encouraging the
Right.
quietest voices to share their concerns. You always learn things. It's a great practice.
I love it. It's kind of like a paper exercise of a chaos monkey of the what if. In the good old days, we would draw on whiteboard of the systems, with circles and lines, and
Mhm.
say sort of where all your greatest fear.
I mean, the tabletop exercises are great as well. You can think of
Mm-hmm.
all how we're going to deal with a particular kind of surprise that's going to hit us and make sure we know what we're
Mm-hmm.
going to do in that kind of event. Those are really important
Right.
too. But the pre-mortem
Mm-hmm.
is really very specific to an upcoming thing we're about to do. We're gonna flip the switch to
Yeah.
change all these feature flags for this new release, and let's take a minute and think of all the ways this could go terribly wrong.
I love it. And I like what you say even before that. It's kind of like what we're saying that assume your mental model is wrong. Assume
Mhm.
people are not sharing. How can you have concerns? And this is really a fun way to create that space.
Yeah,
So David, have you seen systems that were fragile and become resilient through the accumulations of learnings? What did that transformation look like, and how long did it take?
I have seen that organizations adopting the pre-mortem practice and really making it kind of a standard part of their release process or their project lifecycle. I have seen that
Mm,
make a big difference
mm-hmm,
in the success of their launches because they maybe realized they weren't ready, or they realized they needed to have a contingency plan for this particular thing that could go wrong, or they needed to know who to call if this part of the process didn't work right,
mm,
and so they would have those numbers ready. Or in the most elaborate cases, some of the most elaborate cases, they would go so far as to say, okay, here's the boilerplate text we're going to send to our stakeholders during this. Maybe it's a really long migration process, right? We're going to send
mm-hmm.
these updates when we finish stage one, when we finish stage two, stage three, and here's what we're going to send if it didn't work, if we're in trouble, and let's actually prepare what we're going to say if we're in the weeds, so that we can focus on getting out of the weeds and not focus on what we need to tell our stakeholders. So just that level
Right.
of it really heightens that level of preparation
Mm-hmm.
if you really think deeply about all the things that could go wrong.
Right. Make sure you have all the contingency plans, like the traditional days when we plan for the BCDR process, right? Which really help you kind of understand the process and the context.
Yeah,
So, David, how do you scale the power of diversity across teams, especially in the sense of a large or distributed organizations?
I think like one key is adopting the mindset that we are part of a socio-technical system, and that system includes people who build it, the people who manage it, people who test it and deploy it, and the people who use it, and our stack of suppliers that are providing the services we depend on, and our stakeholders that are funding the whole thing. They call it, it's a one big system at one level. Each of those actors, each of those really represents a team. When in all those teams, you've got people, and all those people have different mental models of the system. Every last one of them
Yep.
have different
Yes.
mental models, and that they're all important at sometimes they're critical at different situations. And so what it means to have diverse perspectives on a problem is really to think big about the system in those terms and to solicit input from all those constituents when you're doing a pre-mortem. Like that's the group you would ideally like
Mm-hmm.
to have, is all those representation from all those different groups. And if you're doing a post-incident review, you want to be sharing your findings with representatives from all those different groups and
Mm-hmm.
getting feedback from all those different groups. When you're actually doing the incident learning, you should be, if possible, getting input from all those different groups about what was their experience during the incident. I left out
Wow.
customer support and sales,
Yeah.
and there's others as well that potentially have valuable perspectives. So I think it's
Yeah.
too bad that we commonly do our post-incident learning with the SRE team. And
Yes.
think, sure, it's better than nothing. And if you can get, your other parts of the SRE organization who may be working with different systems to hear what another group has experienced, that's great. But if it's all SREs living and breathing, the SRE air, that sharing, that's still limiting your perspectives. It would be much better if you could create a forum where you've got people who actually talk to customers all the time and people who all these other parts of the ecosystem that I mentioned who could also participate and share. And I think the real challenge is how do we create post-incident review sessions that are interesting and valuable to all these different groups? Because of course everybody's busy,
Mm.
but I think there's a real opportunity there because all these perspectives are valuable.
Speaking of that, you reminded of this probably wow, showing my age here, probably 20 years ago. When I used to sell laptops, we had a incident that took down the site. So essentially what a page that show every single product on that IBM ever sold on one page. None of us
Hmm.
question why,
Hmm.
and our solution was to cache it because caching makes things go away, right?
Hmm.
And then we had a seller, or essentially they kind of the main users of the page, and they can say, "Oh, you know what? I only need to see that page once a month."
Hmm. Hmm.
And that
Right.
response was
Yeah.
a
Mhm.
we were like, what? I was like, oh, and with that we ended up creating, you see where it's going. Oh, let's
Yeah.
run the batch job that runs
Yeah. Yeah.
nightly or weekly. It's
Right.
not a problem we need to solve in real time rendering
Right.
of 5,000 products.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So right there,
Hmm.
David, that diverse perspective not only solve the problem but reduce the complexity of the solution that was needed, right?
That's right. It also speaks to what we were talking about mental models. Like
Yep.
the engineering's mental model is, oh, this thing's going to be used all the time, constantly, needs to be
Hmm.
up to date every minute. And obviously the user had a completely different mental model of the system and how it'd be used.
Yeah, going back to the user, that's why I really appreciate the user research journey, having them part of our learning and
Hmm.
building. It's really, really, really
Yeah.
important. So, David, if we were to go to the inspiration of this podcast, it's all about the omelet in the kitchen, and you gave us a really solid set of ingredients and recipe that resilience isn't built by a single perspective. Resilience is forged by teams with a diverse representation of thoughts of experience so that we can notice the different risks and build a system that better anticipate and mitigate against all those different use cases. If you were to imagine everything we call it here as a recipe card, is there one instruction that you would bold or underline to highlight how important that is?
I'll reiterate that if you're successful, if your system is successful, you're going to eventually be in a situation that's a crisis, and you're going to have to be able to bring in different perspectives and diverse opinions to resolve the problem. I mean, you can just predict that's going to happen if you're running a successful system. going to happen at some point. And your ability to bring in those diverse perspectives is going to depend on laying the groundwork so that people can do that safely and effectively. And practices like pre-mortems are a cheap and easy way to begin to create that kind of culture and cultural norms that enable you to be able to do that when you need to. Avoid overconfidence and keep in mind that true experts know the limits of their expertise.
That's such a wise statement, David. And I'm curious, on the flip side, is there one ingredient that you would wish people stop putting into this recipe of resilience or misconception of what it takes to build a resilient cultural system?
Boy, there are so many. There's so many.
Is that a separate podcast?
Two come immediately to mind. Well, maybe three. So one is we got to stop chasing or stop worrying about recurrence. Like systems are changing all the time. The whole ITIL process of RCAs, and it's really all about preventing recurrence and problem management. Like it's all about preventing the thing that happened from ever happening again, which is fine, sure, but remember, our systems are always changing and our organizations are always changing as well. So people managing the system are constantly rotating. And so, like at the end of the day, is there any such thing as recurrence? Really? You know, if the system's constantly changing, what's actually recurred? That's kind of an extreme perspective, but I think that we really need to worry less about the same thing happening again and worry more about the big surprise that's coming at us and trust our engineering teams that they're going to fix the obvious things that can be fixed. So, okay, so that's one. Another one is automation is not going to save us. Automation
Yeah.
is going to, sure, it's going to do some amazing things, but it's going to create new challenges. Surprises are going to hit us that challenge our mental models. And you're saying our run books have half-lives, and the automation that's written to automate those run books is also going to have half-lives. Do we really know at what time that automation's not, no longer going to work? How do we know? These are new challenges that we're going to have to face. As we automate more and more, the people who know how to do the thing manually become fewer and fewer. It's a problem for those of us today who are using automation to do the things that we used to do manually, but it's going to be an even bigger challenge when nobody's around who used to do the thing manually, and that expertise is no longer around. So that's number. Automation is not going to save us. And the third one is about metrics. We're talking about investments in prevention, investments in preventing bad things from happening. Yeah, you can spend so much time looking for ROI for these things. All of those metrics are flawed. All of those metrics tend to generate unintended behaviors, bad consequences. They're really fraught. So I would not recommend spending too much time looking for hard numbers, and instead look at things like, are your engineers happier? Do they feel more confident about their ability to deal with disruptions in their systems? Do they feel less confident? Do they feel confident that if they're out on a limb and don't know what to do, that they know where to go to get help? Use those kinds of signals, those kinds of sentiments as signals about whether you're on the right path or not.
I love it. It's a sentiment weather system to gauge the health of your system and the resilience.
Mm-hmm.
David, you have so much wisdom in this domain. I know my limits, and every time I talk to you, I grow and learn so much. Really appreciate you coming back to the show, David.
This was great. Thanks, Kevin, for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for listening. Be sure to visit sreomelette.com for more conversations on how the practice of SRE can help you achieve success for your business and your clients. And remember, resilience isn't built in the heat of an incident or in a single moment. It's forged through how we learn, collaborate, and support each other every day. So keep asking questions, keep sharing your perspectives, and keep making your own SRE omelet. See you in the next episode.